Imagine this: a faceless priest in Rome, ink still wet on parchment, decrees from the Vatican traveling across oceans to lands he would never see. With a few strokes of a quill, whole continents were declared possessions of European crowns, and entire civilizations were condemned to be erased, enslaved, or converted. This was not an accident of history, it was policy, sanctified by the Church, and written into the laws of empire. Welcome to Voice from the Colonized, where we bring to light the buried histories of colonization, resistance, and survival. If you're passionate about reclaiming the stories that empire tried to silence, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help us continue producing this content, check the links in the description below to support us financially. Today, we uncover one of the most influential yet least discussed legal and religious doctrines in world history: the Doctrine of Discovery, the papal and imperial framework that justified European colonial expansion, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and whose shadow lingers in modern international law to this very day. The Papal Bulls and the origins of the doctrine. The story begins in the 15th century, during the so-called Age of Discovery. As European powers like Portugal and Spain expanded across the seas, they faced a simple but urgent question: by what right could they claim lands already inhabited by others? The answer came from Rome. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dum Diversas. It granted the King of Portugal the authority to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, and to reduce them to perpetual servitude. This was the first stone laid in the foundation of the Doctrine of Discovery. Just 3 years later, in 1455, Nicholas V expanded this authorization with another bull, Romanus Pontifex. This one gave Portugal exclusive rights to navigate, trade, and conquer along the African coast. It declared that lands not under the rule of a Christian prince could be claimed by Portugal, and their non-Christian inhabitants reduced to subjugation. But perhaps the most infamous papal bull came in 1493, the year after Christopher Columbus voyaged to the Americas. Pope Alexander VI issued Inter Caetera, which granted Spain sovereignty over newly discovered lands west of a certain meridian, while leaving the east to Portugal. This effectively divided the non-European world between two Catholic powers. The language of Inter Caetera is chilling. We give, grant, and assign to you and your heirs all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances to lead the peoples dwelling therein to embrace the Christian faith. In these few words, indigenous peoples across the Americas were stripped of sovereignty, agency, and ownership of their own lands. The Doctrine of Discovery was born not as a secular legal principle, but as a religious mandate, a theological justification for empire. From theology to law. Over time, the Doctrine of Discovery shifted from papal decree into the legal fabric of colonial empires. The underlying principle was simple. Christian nations had the exclusive right to claim sovereignty over non-Christian lands. For indigenous peoples, this meant that their land rights were not recognized as full ownership, but merely as a form of occupancy that could be extinguished by European sovereigns. This legal reasoning was not confined to Europe. It crossed the Atlantic and became enshrined in American law. One of the most pivotal cases was the 1823 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Johnson v. Mintosh. Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for the court, declared that discovery gave title to the government subject only to the Indian right of occupancy. In other words, native nations could live on their lands, but ultimate sovereignty and ownership rested with the United States. This ruling wasn't invented from scratch. It directly cited and built upon the Doctrine of Discovery. Marshall's opinion made clear that European nations had assumed sovereignty over indigenous lands by virtue of discovery, and that the United States inherited this right. Thus, a religious justification from the 15th century became the bedrock of 19th century American property law. The legal impact was devastating. Indigenous treaties were undermined, Sovereign nations were reduced to dependent wards. Lands could be seized without consent. This legal precedent still influences cases today, more than 2 centuries later. Global reach and colonial expansion. Though born in Rome, the doctrine of discovery spread far beyond Iberia. Other European empires, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, adopted its principles. In North America, British colonists used it to justify settlement and expansion, claiming indigenous lands were vacant unless occupied by Christians. In Australia, the doctrine fed into the concept of terra nullius, the idea that the land belonged to no one, despite thousands of years of Aboriginal presence. In Africa, colonial powers carved up the continent in the 19th century, echoing the same logic first used along its coasts in the 15th century. Everywhere it spread, the doctrine created the same outcome: the dispossession of indigenous peoples, the erosion of their sovereignty, and the expansion of European dominion under the banner of Christianity and civilization. The doctrine in modern law. It would be comforting to think of the doctrine of discovery as an artifact of history, an embarrassing relic of medieval Europe, but its influence persists. In the United States, Johnson versus Mintosh remains binding precedent. Courts continue to rely on its reasoning in disputes over native land rights. Internationally, the legacy of the doctrine shapes legal concepts like sovereignty, territorial acquisition, and property rights. Even the United Nations has had to grapple with its shadow. In 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This historic document rejected doctrines based on superiority or colonization, but the fact that such a statement was necessary speaks volumes. The doctrine of discovery still underpins many modern legal systems. Indigenous activists across the world have called for the Vatican to rescind the original papal bulls. In 2023, after years of pressure, the Vatican finally released a statement acknowledging that the doctrine of discovery is not part of the Catholic faith and that its concepts fail to recognize the inherent human rights of indigenous peoples. But for many indigenous communities, this was too little, too late. The doctrine may be disavowed in words, but its consequences remain etched into borders, laws, and economies. Resistance and reclamation. Despite centuries of dispossession, indigenous peoples have never stopped resisting the doctrine of discovery. Native nations in North America continue to fight legal battles for land recognition, sovereignty, and treaty rights. Aboriginal communities in Australia challenge the legacy of terra nullius, as seen in the landmark Mabo case of 1992, which finally recognized native title. In Canada, First Nations leaders demand that the government dismantle policies rooted in discovery doctrines. Across Latin America, indigenous movements tie land struggles directly to the legacy of papal bulls and colonial decrees. The movement to repudiate the doctrine of discovery is not just about the past, it's about dismantling ongoing structures of colonialism and asserting indigenous sovereignty today. Conclusion. The doctrine's long shadow. The doctrine of discovery may sound like a dusty piece of medieval theology, but its consequences are everywhere. It shaped the borders of nations, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and the very structure of modern property law. It sanctified conquest as salvation and turned colonization into divine mandate. And yet, it is not unchallenged. Indigenous peoples continue to resist, reclaim, and reimagine their sovereignty. They remind us that while empire may have written its doctrines on paper, communities write their survival in lived resistance. As we reflect on this history, the challenge is clear: to recognize the colonial foundations of our world and to work toward dismantling the systems that sustain them. This has been Voice from the Colonized. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe, and help us keep producing decolonial content by supporting us financially through the links in the description. Because history is not just about what happened, it's about who gets to tell it.